right, everybody. Welcome to your week 6 extension activity. I'm recording a video for you this week so that you can engage in the content that builds after imperialism, specifically for today, the conversation about World War I and the way it impacted American society. Now, in our live session this week, we talked about American imperialism, this new role on the world stage that ultimately culminates in the U.S. engaging in World War I, right, eventually after some delay, and then the U.S. choosing to not ratify the Treaty of Versailles and not join the League of Nations. So in a sense, by the end of that imperialism time period of the early 1900s into the late 19-teens, it's important to note that there have been some changes and some continuities, right? Change. U.S. is more involved in overseas entities with colonies, right, and with influence, big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, moral diplomacy, right? The U.S. has expanded its reach. Continuity, however, is this refusal to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. This refusal to join the League of Nations demonstrates a strong continuity that was first established with Washington's farewell address on maintaining independence from foreign alliances. So that's kind of the foreign policy look at this era. Today, real briefly, I only have about 10 slides. We're going to talk about the way the war impacts American society at home. Now, if you want to think about this in like a 20-year window, right? In a 20-year window, we have on foreign policy, imperialism and World War I, right, from 1898 to 1918. Imperialism, right, Spanish-American War, Philippine-American War, Panama Canal, Boxer Rebellion in China, all the foreign policy things. Imperialism, World War I. At the exact same time, domestically, we also have two important events, and that's the Progressive Era and also World War I and the way that impacts domestic society. So I really want you to be able to think through the last 2 weeks of our instruction, progressivism, imperialism, World War I, as part of the same like 20-year window of time. It just kind of concludes here with World War I American society before next week we'll jump into the 1920s. So a couple of key concepts are there to note. I included them at the tail end of your handout. I'm going to ask you to include SFI, specific factual information that supports each of these assertions from College Board. This is the stuff College Board says you have to know. You'll include SFI that supports that statement or that fact, okay? So first things first, like all wars, and this is an important continuity as well, like all wars, World War I expands the size, the power, and the influence of the federal government. In that way, it is a continuity of progressive era reform. But I showed you that slide last week in our live session that showed the growth in the size, the volume of federal employees working in the government, right, enforcing all these new progressive rules, reforms, and regulations. The same thing's going to hold true for World War I, but like much, much more so. Right? Wars always accelerate the growth and power of the federal government. This war is no different. 5,000 new government agencies are created to try to coordinate the war effort in terms of supplying troops, in terms of labor, in terms of the economy at home, all these really important things that are required. Wilson and his administration are going to approach this much like progressive reform, from a place of efficiency, from a place of managing the government in a way that makes the war the most successful. A couple to know. First is the War Industries Board. It's a big one you should note. The WIB, it's good SFI. The War Industries Board is going to actually supervise all factories, ensuring that ensuring that the economy is only producing things the country actually needs. So in a sense, this is very, very anti-laissez-faire capitalism, but much more regulatory, overseeing all factories, ensuring that the priorities the country has laid out for the war effort are being met, and even fixing consumer prices, right? Mandating that goods only cost X amount of dollars in a way to try to combat inflation. The Food Administration is going to play a significant role in supplying food to the soldiers that are fighting the war, both US soldiers and our allies, by appealing to citizens to use less. Going back one, the WIB director, the guy in charge of the War Industries Board, Bernard Baruch, becomes known at the time as the dictator of the American economy because he has such power to regulate what gets produced, how much it gets charged for, etc. Right. With the Food Administration, we see them appealing to Americans' patriotism and sensibilities, asking for a spirit of self-sacrifice, asking a specific day of the week for families to go meatless or wheatless, so that meat or wheat could be diverted instead to supplying the soldiers. And also encouraging Americans to plant victory gardens, right? Grow your own food, and that allows then more food that's being mass produced by farms to be sent overseas. The Fuel Administration. The Fuel Administration is another agency which is going to put pretty strict rations on coal and oil so that the war industries, the factories, the ships all have enough fuel for their priorities. We're going to see the imposition of gasless days and the shutting down of factories that aren't seen as a priority for days and days at a time to conserve the fuel or the coal needed for their factories. So we really see that. I think it's important to note this is a huge expansion of federal government intervention in the economy. And then three more infrastructure-based organizations, the Railroad Administration, the War Shipping Board, and the War Trade Board are going to work quite specifically on logistics, on moving people, on moving resources, on moving supplies, et cetera. So it's important to note that wars always increase the power of the federal government, and World War I is a particularly poignant example of that fact. Now, the war is actually going to impact workers, the working class, in two really specific ways. And I need you to be aware of both of these influences. First, World War I is going to be quite good for labor unions, right? Laborers are needed, right? You need to keep working to supply the war effort. So labor is going to be treated quite nicely during World War I, especially the moderate labor unions that aren't advocating things like overthrow and socialism. But the American Federation of Labor that we talked about in the Gilded Age, the guy in charge, Samuel Gompers, the Gomp, he is named to a new organization, the Council of National Defense. So we're seeing government and labor unions working together for the first time. They're taking the most prominent labor activist in the country at the time and putting him on this Council of National Defense to try to increase the credibility of the government asking for union support for the war effort, which is great. We've not yet seen an alliance and an agreement made between labor and the government in this way, but all is fair in love and war. And second, the War Labor Board, another government agency, is formed to standardize wages and hours to ensure that workers in, for example, steel factories are all being paid the same and fairly, to ensure that they're all working 8-hour shifts, to protect union rights and give equal pay even for women. So both of these examples demonstrate to us this new alliance between the government and labor unions. This is not going to last after the war. Let me make that quite clear right now. One of the really important turns after the war is a much broader feeling of anti-unions as the Red Scare sets in. So that's the first. I have this good cartoon that kind of illustrates the relationship, though, right? That we have this union laborer going on strike, being spanked by Uncle Sam, saying, "I'm sick and tired of this nonsense." We do, in fact, see the government forcing workers to not strike or forcing striking workers back to work to supply the war effort, with the justification being like, we've already standardized your wages. We've already given you the hours that you want. You can't go on strike. We're trying to fight and win a war. The next group of workers that are really impacted is Black workers. Industrial jobs in the North and in the West are going to really, for the first time, attract Black workers who are fleeing Southern violence, Southern lynching, Southern Jim Crow. We talked a lot at the end of the Civil War about the plight, the struggles of newly freed, formerly enslaved individuals. The problem was, like, there's nowhere they could go necessarily. Like the life they know is in the South, the work they know is in agriculture, and it's not like the North's just inviting these formerly enslaved individuals up with open arms. But World War I creates industrial jobs with a shortage of labor as we send a lot of men overseas, and more factories are being opened up that are finally attracting Black laborers in a large number. This becomes known as the Great Migration. It's important to note, make sure you note it in your notes, the Great Migration, which begins in the 19-teens here in World War I. It's going to continue all the way through World War II, as a matter of fact. We see the mass migration of African Americans out of the South and into northern cities like Detroit, cities like Harlem in New York, cities like LA, right? And where they're going to find war production jobs. Right? Another reason this is influenced is immigration's almost completely stopped from Europe. You may know from your experiences in world history how dangerous it is to ship people or goods during this time because of the German U-boats, their underwater submarines that are sinking ships. So immigration, because of the war in Europe, comes to a near standstill. Right? So the U.S. is in this dynamic of no longer being able to rely on immigration for jobs, having fewer men in America as it is because they're going to head off to fight the war, and that perfect and needing more industrial capacity because of the war, and that perfect storm creates an opportunity for Black individuals to leave the South in great numbers and settle in northern cities. However, things are not all peachy in the North, as they will face increasing northern discrimination based on race in a way we have not seen before. I think this is not because the North was less racist necessarily. It's just the North had fewer African American people, so there was less necessity in using race as a means to subject African Americans to this second-class citizenship. White workers are going to turn their previous nativist perspective, their anti-immigrant perspective, to an anti-African American perspective because of, again, this fear of competitive labor sources, being willing to work jobs for cheaper, for example. This cartoon is great, right? This great cartoon about some of the race riots that are going to break out after World War I. But this idea that the color line has reached the North, right? So that even in the North, they're still desiring a color line to be put in place between Black and white, without the history and tradition of slavery and Jim Crow. The philosophy and the beliefs are still quite the same. The U.S. government's also going to rely heavily on propaganda to portray the U.S. as the good guys and the Germans specifically as the bad guys, right? Like this idea of America as a damsel in distress being attacked by a brute, right? Enlist, join the army to go attack this big monster, right? Buy more Liberty bonds, buy more Liberty bonds, buy more Liberty bonds, right? Liberty bonds, of course, we've talked about bonds before, are like short-term loans to the government. You buy them, they pay you back in 5-10 years plus interest. So it's a way to kind of crowdsource the war effort, the cost of the war. And even appealing to women here, right? Oh boy, that's the girl, the Salvation Army lassie, appealing to women's desire to get into the workplace as well, to enlist in jobs that allow women to play their part. So the propaganda is important because it's also going to lead to some anti-immigrant sentiment after the war, right? We portray these people as brutes and enemies for 4 or 5 years after the war. Don't be surprised if people haven't forgotten about that. And not necessarily unsurprising, but still quite disappointing, we see a significant limitation on civil liberties during World War I. Now, this isn't new. We talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1890s under the Adams administration that is specifically about French Revolution sentiment. We talked about Lincoln and civil liberties during the Civil War. Here in World War I, Wilson and his administration are going to significantly curtail or tighten civil liberties around freedom of speech with 2 important acts. First is the Espionage Act of 1917, and the second is the Sedition Act of 1918. Now, this cartoon shows obviously a much more rosy view of these cartoons, as here's Uncle Sam rounding up, it says IWW, you may remember that. They're the International Workers of the World, the much more socialist labor organization, as well as these traitors and these spies that are also being rounded up by Uncle Sam because the sedition law is passed back there at the Capitol. But what the Espionage Act does is it prohibits any interference of military operations, prevents anything you're doing that might get in the way of military operations, as well as prohibiting any cause of insubordination, refusal to listen to authorities, and also prohibiting obstruction of recruitment and enlistment. This is the big one down here. Prohibiting obstruction, getting in the way of recruiting soldiers or enlisting soldiers. So we see here is people that are organizing like anti-draft protests being put in jail under this law. People that are actively working to discourage people from joining the military by saying this is an immoral war for capitalist gain are being put in jail for that. Right? So this Espionage Act of 1917 is then followed up by the Sedition Act of 1918, which forbids, and it does clarify only in the time of war, during war, that you're not allowed to use disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government, the U.S. flag, the U.S. institutions, or the U.S. military. So what this says to me, though, is that during war, you're not allowed to criticize the government anymore, right? Which, if we're going to be quite honest, sounds like a direct violation of the First Amendment. Some people agreed. But what Wilson's trying to do is encourage U.S. unity, encourage togetherness, encourage same pageness, like Lincoln during the Civil War, using force if needed. Now, There's a whole bunch of people that are not happy about this, and people that are arrested on these charges and then put in jail for these charges. So much so that 3 really influential court cases make their way to the Supreme Court right after the war, asking, like, was it constitutional? Was it allowed for the government to restrict the freedom of speech in this way just because it was a war? Now, the first example is Eugene Debs. We know Eugene Debs, labor activist. He ran for president in 1916 as a socialist, 1912 as well. We've seen his name on election maps before. Eugene Debs is arrested under the Espionage Act, this act here, because he was organizing an anti-enlistment, anti-draft event. And the Supreme Court ruled that no, that this was allowed. The government does have this authority because of wartime, that it's justified in doing these, what we would consider extra legal moves during a normal time. That's important. Debs versus the United States is the first court case. The second that I'm going to ask you to note as well is Schenck versus the United States, in which the Supreme Court ruled that, yeah, there are limits to freedom of speech. It's where they use the idea of you're not allowed to go into a crowded movie theater and yell fire when there's not actually a fire, because that creates a danger for society. And they use that same standard of dangerous speech that creates a clear and present danger is the word that's used. Congress is allowed to regulate that and make that illegal, and they then apply that to anti-war rhetoric, anti-war speech in World War I. Thus, again, ruling in this case that the Sedition Act is constitutional. And the last one, Abrams versus the United States, is going to do the same thing, but just with published goods. The government's going to seize and destroy pamphlets that are anti-war, and Abrams versus the United States is going to argue, is going to state by the Supreme Court that because these publications were obviously intended to defeat the war plans of the government of the United States, therefore stopping them was allowed by the government. So in all 3 of these court cases, the thing to note is the Supreme Court then okayed it. The Supreme Court allowed this restriction of civil liberties because it was a war, and those are all 3 good examples of court cases that back up this idea. Now, after the war, we're going to see some significant consequences and ramifications of what was happening during the war. The first is a recession. Shouldn't surprise us. We see a significant downturn in the economy after the war. Before the war, because all of Europe is fighting themselves, our economy is booming because we're supplying war supplies to England, food to France, right? Like the economy is pumping it out because of the war. Well, the war is over now. So now you don't have free reign, right, to sell as much as you want crop-wise to Europe. And also you don't need to keep selling war supplies because the war is over. So this shift from a war economy with massive production and massive volumes of whatever is possible and needed for the war effort shifts to a peacetime economy, and that causes a huge downturn in demand, which then leads to jobs lost and falling wages, etc. These prices and wage controls that were established, right, when the government's saying you can only charge this, you have to pay that, this control on prices and wages are taken away. So we're back to more of a non-regulated state, which means prices go up, wages go down. Overproduction is always a cause, and this is no different. There's a huge decline, as I already alluded to, in foreign demand. And because of during the war inflation, because of production, the working class is now demanding higher wages to keep up with the inflation. And all these troops are coming back, right, that also need jobs, which leads then to more unemployment. As then consumerism decline, consumer demand declines, government demand declines because fewer people are working. All that told creates a pretty significant recession after the war, as the economy drops by over 20%. Unemployment gets to almost 11%. And then we're going to see a significant amount of labor strikes as the laboring class is pissed about these changes, and race riots, as many workers are going to blame Black workers for the problems that they find themselves in. This cartoon does a good job of pointing out the conflict, right? The laboring class with their strikes, fighting against big capital, here in what looks like the shipyards of one of the port cities. So after the war, 1919 actually ends up as one of the most chaotic years in American history. And believe it or not, right after World War I, we're going to see a series of huge strikes. I'm not talking like the Homestead Steel strike when all the workers in one plant go on strike. I'm talking about like the entire city of Seattle. All the workers in the city of Seattle go on a general strike. The entire Boston Police Department goes on strike. Workers in the steel industry nationwide go on strike. Same with the coal workers nationwide go on strike. And what they're demanding is wages to obviously go up, like labor unions always do with strikes. But their argument is that they did their part during the war. And now that the war is over and there's this recession, like they're the ones who are being screwed. Like we did our part, we didn't go on strike, we didn't get raises, we didn't get this or that because we're all in it for the war. But the war's over, and now we're the ones getting the short end of the stick. So their strikes, I imagine, are legitimately necessary in their motivations, but because of the global context, and this is really important for 1919, because of the global context, right after the Russian Revolution, Americans get quite worried that what happened in Russia is happening here. The working class is rising up to install a system of communism and socialism. And all these workers going on strike is going to eventually lead us down a road of radicalism and no more capitalism in the country. So these strikes actually get quite a negative public perception. The laborers get associated with radicals, with extremes like socialists, like the international workers of the world. There's this fear of a Bolshevik revolution happening here in the United States. And the strikes themselves are causing shortages for products society needs, like coal and steel, right? So we see in this cartoon here in the bottom right, the steel strike, and the caption says coming out of the smoke, and it's just a flag that says red, again, alluding to the fact that they're actually striking to put in place communism. And then here we have Uncle Sam. Just when I had some advantage and started the race for the world markets, the U.S. is closed on account of strikes. There's cobwebs everywhere, and labor and capital are beefing about problems. Right? If capital and labor don't pull together. So both these cartoons kind of demonstrate what's happening in 1919, but it's important to note that these strikes are a direct product of conditions during World War I. All of this told is going to contribute to something that I alluded to in 2 weeks ago's video. We talked about, last week's video about the shortcoming of the progressive era is the first Red Scare. Right? It's a combination of World War I dynamics. It's a combination of existing nativism dynamics. It's a combination of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution dynamics, as well as a culmination of progressive era desire to reform and purify society. So the first Red Scare, which of course implies there will be a second Red Scare, like the first and second Great Awakening, is caused by this nationwide fear that communism is coming to America. Now it's caused by American nationalism during the war, right? We're portraying the other side as bad. It's caused by a congressional committee, the Overman Committee, which begins discovering what they call un-American activities and recommending deportations of anarchists and socialists and anti-government agitators. You can make an argument this is a continuation of the Espionage and Sedition Act policies of you're either for America or you're against America. The Russian Revolution, I already referenced, the post-World War I recession, labor strikes. There's a series of anarchist bombings and race riots as well that gripped the country in 1919, which is going to lead to this era of fear and anti-communist, anti-socialist perspectives. Right? This cartoon kind of does it for us, blaming labor unions for getting us there. Right? The argument that's present here is that first it's strikes, and then disorder and riots, and then Bolshevism and murders, and then chaos, and then what comes next? It's just a big question mark. Right? But again, it's tying labor unions to this desire to create communism in America. The last part of the post-World War I world that we need to discuss is the race riots, right? Because African Americans have left the South in such large numbers and settled in northern cities, after the war, we're seeing in new places where this did not exist before, biracial societies, and that's going to lead to significant white mob violence against Black Americans happening in not the South. All right, so this is fueled by entrenched racism that's always existed, that is then heightened by economic competition over jobs as troops are returning from war and jobs are decreasing, right? Unemployment's going up. So this competition over jobs leads to what becomes known as the Red Summer of 1919. 36 cities nationwide are going to experience race riots, white on Black race riots. Chicago is potentially the best example, as we see down here. July and August sees a huge amount of race conflict after a young Black man went to the whites-only beach in Lake Michigan, and that creates I know. As disgusting as it is that this would cause a race riot, this is exactly what causes the race riot. And 23 black people are killed, 15 white people are killed. And eventually the federal authorities are called in to try to restore order in Chicago. Omaha, Nebraska, the following month, a white mob is going to come together and lynch William Brown, a black man, simply because he was accused of sexual assault of a white woman with no evidence. And that is going to, again, heighten the reality of vigilante justice in places other than just the South. And then 2 years later, we see maybe our best example, the Tulsa race riot, in which this entire stretch of very successful black society called Greenwood Avenue, called by Booker T. Washington, who we talked about last week, called it Negro Wall Street, because it was a place where all the successful black business people lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A black shoe shiner, guy who shines shoes, is accused of assaulting a white woman. We see a significant amount of white mob violence against black people. They are actually going to destroy that entire street of black success. A reported 26 black people are killed and 10 white people are killed. And it just goes to illustrate like the racial tension that now exists places outside of just the South, because the North is no longer just a white and an immigrant population, but we're seeing some more racial diversity in our cities. So those are the consequences of World War I. Make sure you add a couple, 3-4 details for each of those key concepts that are at the bottom of your handout. And I will see you next week in our live session talking about the Roaring 20s. Bye, y'all.